settle in. Let the room grow quiet. Let the hum of the day fade to a soft, distant murmur. You are safe, and the hour is late, and we have time. Time to walk a very old path along a very old wall, under a sky thick with stars that have watched over this city for more than 1,000 years. Close your eyes if you like, or let them rest on something soft and still. Tonight, we are going to visit Constantinople, not the noisy, crowded city of merchants and emperors, but the silent, shadowed city of the night. We will walk with the night watchmen, those quiet figures who moved along the great land walls when everyone else was asleep. Imagine, if you will, the Theodosian walls. They stretch across the western edge of the city, a triple line of stone and brick that had stood for centuries, holding back wave after wave of would-be conquerors. By day, they were a spectacle, a massive fortification dotted with towers, patrolled by soldiers, bustling with activity. But at night, they transformed into something else entirely. The stone seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper, and the silence, once the gates were shut and barred, became a living thing. It was in this silence that the watchmen did their work. The watchmen were not the elite troops of the Imperial Guard. They were ordinary men, often drawn from the local population. Men who knew every crack in the mortar, every uneven step of the parapet. They were paid modestly, but the duty was considered honorable and necessary. When the last light of dusk faded from the sky and the great bronze gates groaned shut, the watchmen took their posts. They lit their lanterns, took their staves, and began the slow, measured patrol that would last until dawn. You might picture a watchman, let us call him Lucas, standing on the inner parapet of the wall, leaning against a merlin, the solid stone block that gave him cover. His lantern, a small clay lamp with a wick soaked in olive oil, cast a warm, golden pool of light around his feet. Beyond that pool, the darkness was absolute. He could see the torches of other watchmen along the wall, tiny orange flames that moved slowly, like fireflies. The air was cool, often damp, and carried the smell of sea salt and stone, and the faint, earthy scent of the countryside beyond the walls. The distance, perhaps, the sound of a dog barking, or the howl of a jackal from the hills. These were the sounds that accompanied him through the long hours. His job was simple: to watch, to look, to listen. He was to notice any unusual movement beyond the wall, any flicker of torchlight that did not belong, any sound that might indicate a sapper tunneling beneath the foundations. But most nights, there was nothing. The enemy was far away, or the threat was imagined. The watchman's real battle was against sleep. The body grew heavy, the eyelids drooped, the mind began to wander. He would stamp his feet, shift his weight from one leg to the other, take a sip of watered wine from a leather flask. He might recite a prayer under his breath, or count the stars, or think of his wife and children asleep in a small house inside the city walls. The walls themselves were a world of their own. The inner wall, the highest, stood about 40 feet tall. In front of it was a lower wall, and then the outer wall, and then a wide ditch, the moat, which could be flooded with water if needed. Between the walls ran a broad terrace called the Parabolos, where soldiers could move easily from one tower to another. The towers, there were 96 of them on the inner wall, and more on the outer, were spaced at regular intervals, each one a small fortress in itself. Each tower had 2 levels, sometimes 3, with arrow slits and stone floors that echoed hollowly underfoot. At night, the towers were dark except for the watchman's lantern, and they held a strange, cold stillness, as if the stones themselves remembered the countless nights of vigilance that had passed. The watchmen operated in shifts, each shift lasting perhaps 4 hours, though the records are not precise. They had a system of signals, a whistle, a call, a knock on the stone with a staff. If a watchman grew too weary, he could rouse his neighbor, who would keep an eye on his section until he returned. There was camaraderie in this shared darkness, a bond formed not by words, but by the simple act of staying awake together. They were the eyes of the city, and the city slept because they watched. But it was not a glamorous watch. There was no glory in it, no songs sung about the night watchmen of Constantinople. History remembers the great sieges, the dramatic battles, the heroic emperors. But the night watchmen, they are ghosts, barely mentioned in the chronicles. Yet they were there every single night for over 1,000 years. Generation after generation of men standing on those same stones, looking out into the darkness, wondering what might come. Sometimes something did come. Not an army, but a single figure. A spy, a deserter, a traitor who had lost his way. The watchman would call out, his voice sharp in the stillness. The figure would halt, raise his hands, speak some password or piece of news, and the watchman would either let him pass or hold him until daylight. These were the small dramas of the night, the moments of tension that broke the monotony. But for the most part, the night was a long, slow river of time, and the watchman drifted with it. Let us step inside one of the towers for a moment. Imagine the interior. A small hearth, cold now, for fires were not allowed at night lest they attract attention. A wooden bench, a hook on the wall for the lantern. The stone walls rough and cool to the touch. Through the arrow slit, a narrow slice of starry sky. The watchman might sit here for a while, his back against the wall, listening to the faint sounds of the city at rest. The occasional distant cry of a night bird, the rustle of rats in the ditch below, the creak of a wooden gate. These were his companions. And what of the city itself? Constantinople was a city of 500,000 souls, perhaps more. It was the largest city in Christendom, a vast labyrinth of streets, markets, churches, and palaces. But at night, it fell silent. The great forums emptied. The colonnaded streets became dark canyons. Only the watchmen and the city guards moved through this sleeping world, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies. The walls were the boundary between the safe, sleeping city and the wild, unknown lands beyond. And on the walls, the watchmen were the guardians of that boundary. They had other duties too, besides watching for enemies. They kept an eye on the ditch, making sure no one had fallen in. They checked the gates, ensuring they were properly barred. They listened for the sound of water, for a broken aqueduct or a burst pipe could be as dangerous as a siege. They were the first line of defense against fire, too. In a city where many buildings were made of wood, a fire at night could spread quickly. If the watchman saw a glow from within the city, he would sound the alarm, and men would rush with buckets and hooks to tear down burning houses. So his watch was for internal threats as well as external. The seasons changed on the walls, but the watch remained. Winter was the hardest. The wind from the Sea of Marmara cut through the stone, and the watchman wrapped himself in a thick woolen cloak, his breath pluming in the cold. Snow would gather in the crenellations, and the parapets grew slick with ice. He stamped his feet to keep the blood moving. Sometimes a fellow watchman would bring a hot drink, something with honey and herbs, and they would share a moment of warmth before returning to their posts. Spring brought milder air, but also rain, and the stone became slippery and treacherous. Summer brought heat, but the nights were short, and the watchman could sit on the parapet and watch the stars move slowly overhead. Autumn was the season of mists, when the wall seemed to float above a sea of white fog, and the world beyond was hidden and strange. Through all these seasons, the watchmen spoke to each other in low voices or in silence. They had no clocks except the stars and the church bells. They knew the hour by the position of the constellations or by the distant chime of the great church of Hagia Sophia, whose dome they could see from the higher towers, a dark silhouette against the sky. The bell marked the hours of prayer, and the watchman listened for it, measuring the night in this slow, sacred rhythm. One could say the watchmen were the city's heartbeat, slow and steady, pulsing through the long darkness. They were not meant to be heroes, they were meant to be present. And in their presence, the city felt safe. The people of Constantinople trusted the walls, yes, but they also trusted the men who walked them, those anonymous figures who never slept while others slept. Let me tell you a story, one that comes down to us from a medieval source. It is a small story, not grand, but it captures something of the spirit of these night watchmen. One night during the reign of Emperor Michael II, a watchman saw a light moving along the outer wall beyond the moat. It was a torch carried by a figure on horseback, riding slowly along the ditch. The watchman raised his staff and called out. The figure stopped, and the watchman asked for the password. The figure said nothing, but held up a hand, and the torch flared brighter. The watchman saw that the figure was an old man, bearded, dressed in simple robes. He called out again, and the old man simply nodded and rode on into the darkness. The watchman did not report it, for there was no threat, only a strange, silent traveler. The next morning, the watchman was questioned by an officer who had heard of the incident. The watchman described the old man, and the officer became pale. He said that was the emperor himself, out on one of his nightly wanderings. He often does this, testing the watchfulness of his guards. The watchman was not punished. He was praised. He had done his duty, and the emperor had seen it. The story may not be true. It may be one of those legends that accumulate around old walls and forgotten lives, but it speaks to the idea that the watchmen were not invisible, not entirely. Someone noticed their vigilance. Even an emperor, cloaked in darkness, could see the lantern on the wall and know that his city was awake. As the night wore on, the watchman Lucas, or whatever his name was, would feel the first gray hint of dawn. The stars would begin to fade. The eastern sky would lighten slowly, from black to deep blue to pale rose. The birds would start to sing. And from inside the city, a rooster would crow. The great gates would groan again as the day guards arrived to take over. The night watchman would lower his lantern, stretch his stiff limbs, and walk down the stone steps into the waking city. He would go home, to bed, to sleep while the sun climbed. And the cycle would begin again, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries more, until the walls themselves were breached, and the city fell, and the night watchman vanished into the long river of time. But tonight, they are still here, in our imagination. We can walk with them, feel the cool stone under our fingers, hear the soft whisper of the wind, see the distant lights of the city below. This is the world of the Byzantine night watchman, a world of patience and silence and small, steady courage. It is a world that invites us to slow down, to breathe, to listen. And if you are feeling drowsy, that is only fitting. For these men spent their nights in a kind of waking dream, a state of alert relaxation, their senses open but their bodies still. So let yourself drift. Let the wall surround you. Let the centuries fall away. And in the quiet of this late hour, we will continue our walk deeper into the night, along the great walls of Constantinople. We will continue our walk deeper into the night, along the great walls of Constantinople. Let us leave the land walls for a moment, those famous triple fortifications that faced the open country, and turn instead toward the sea. For the city was not only guarded by stone and earth on its western side, it was also wrapped by the waters of the Bosporus and the Sea of Marmara. And here too, there were watchmen. The sea walls were lower than the land walls, but they were no less important. They ran along the shoreline, sometimes directly at the water's edge, sometimes set back a little, with a narrow strip of beach or a quay between them and the waves. The watchmen here had a different view. Instead of fields and distant hills, they saw the dark expanse of the sea, the glimmer of moonlight on the water, the slow movement of clouds. On clear nights, they could see the lights of ships far out, like tiny stars that had fallen to the surface. They could hear the lap of water against the stones, the creak of a boat's timbers, the distant call of a fisherman casting his nets. These sea wall watchmen had their own rhythms. They watched for pirates, for enemy ships that might try to land in the dark, for smugglers who might slip through the gaps in the harbor chain. The chain itself was a marvel, a great iron barrier that stretched across the entrance to the Golden Horn, the deep inlet that formed the city's northern harbor. It was raised at night, or when danger threatened, and the watchmen at the sea gate kept a close eye on it. They listened for the sound of boats being rowed silently, for the muffled splash of oars. Sometimes they would see a small skiff hugging the shore, and they would shout down, asking for the boat's purpose. And if the answer was not satisfactory, they would send an arrow or a stone from a small catapult mounted on the tower. But the sea walls also had a quieter side. The watchmen here could see the reflections of the city's lights on the water, the lamps in the windows of the great palaces, the lanterns on the masts of merchant ships anchored in the harbor. On summer nights, the air was warm and salty, and the watchman might lean against the parapet and watch the fireflies among the reeds along the shore. He might hear music from a distant banquet, the faint sound of a lyre or a flute. It was a liminal place where the city met the water, and the watchman was part of that boundary. Let us stay with one such watchman for a while. His name, we might imagine, was Nikephoros, a common name in the empire, meaning bearer of victory. He was not a young man, nor an old one. He had been a soldier once in the Tagmata, the imperial guard, but his knees had given way, and he had been assigned to the sea walls as a quieter duty. He did not mind. He liked the salt air, the sound of the waves, the way the moon seemed to climb out of the sea. He knew the names of the constellations, and he would trace them with his finger as he walked. There was Orion, the hunter, with his belt of 3 stars. There was the Great Bear, turning slowly around the pole. And there was the Milky Way, which the Byzantines called the road to Jerusalem, a pale river of light across the sky. Nikephoros carried a staff, like all watchmen, but he also had a horn, a long curved horn made of brass, with a mouthpiece of carved bone. If he saw danger, he would blow it, and the sound would carry across the water, alerting the other towers. He had never blown it in earnest, only for drills or for festivals when the city celebrated and the watchmen joined in with their horns and drums. But he kept it polished and ready, hanging from a leather strap at his side. One night, in the early autumn of the year 821, Nikephoros saw something unusual. It was a faint glow on the water far out, toward the Prince's Islands. It was too steady to be lightning, too low to be a star. He watched it for a long time, his eyes straining. The glow grew brighter, and then he realized it was a ship, a large ship, with lanterns at the prow and stern. But it was moving slowly, too slowly for a ship under sail, and it was heading directly toward the sea walls, not toward the harbor entrance. Nikephoros raised his staff and called out to the watchman in the next tower, a younger man named Theodore, who had better eyes. Theodore squinted and said, "It is an imperial dromon, a warship, but its oars are not moving. It is drifting." Nikephoros felt a chill. A ship drifting in the night, with lights burning and no sign of life. It was strange, perhaps dangerous. He blew his horn, a long, low note that echoed over the water. The other watchmen along the wall took up the call, and soon torches were lit on the towers, casting flickering light onto the water. The dromon drifted closer. It was indeed a warship, with a bronze ram at the bow, and a single mast with a furled sail. The lanterns illuminated the deck, but there was no one there. No rowers at the benches, no sailors at the helm. It was as if the ship had been abandoned, left to drift on the currents. The watchmen watched it come, their hearts beating faster. Some of them had heard tales of ghost ships, of vessels crewed by the souls of drowned men, But these were practical men, and they did not believe such things. When the drahman was within 100 yards of the wall, Nikephoros saw a figure on the deck. A single man standing at the prow, wearing a long dark robe. He was not moving, not calling out. He simply stood there, looking toward the city. The watchman shouted to him, asking his name, his purpose. He did not answer. Nikephoros felt a prickle of fear, but he also felt a duty to investigate. He called down to the gate, where a small boat was kept for such occasions. He and Theodore launched the boat, taking a lantern and a stout rope, and rowed out toward the drahman. The sea was calm, and the boat moved silently. As they approached the warship, Nikephoros saw that the figure at the prow was not a living man. It was a statue, a bronze statue of a soldier, dressed in antique armor, with a spear in his hand. The statue was bolted to the deck, and the lanterns had been placed around it, making it look like a living guard. The ship itself was in perfect condition, as if it had just been launched, but there was no crew, no cargo, no sign of anyone having been on board. Nikephoros and Theodore climbed aboard, their footsteps echoing on the empty deck. They searched the ship from prow to stern, but they found nothing. No food, no water, no personal belongings. Only the statue and the lanterns. It was as if the ship had been prepared as a gift or a warning, and set adrift to find its way to the city. They reported the discovery to their commander, who came down to the wall with a scribe and a priest. The priest examined the statue and declared it to be an ancient image of the Archangel Michael, the patron of the Imperial Guard. He said it was a sign, a blessing from heaven. The statue was taken to the Church of the Archangel, near the Great Palace, and the ship was towed into the harbor and later used as a grain carrier. Nikephoros was given a small reward, a purse of gold coins, but more than that, he gained a story. For the rest of his life, he would tell the tale of the ghost ship that came in the night, and how he had found the statue of the Archangel, and his fellow watchmen would listen and nod and remember that the night held mysteries and that their vigilance had uncovered something wonderful. But for most nights, the watchman's life was not filled with wonders. It was filled with the ordinary, the repetitive, the slow passage of hours. And it is in these ordinary moments that we find the true character of the Byzantine night watchmen. They were not heroes of epic poems. They were men who did their duty, night after night, year after year, without fame or much reward. They were men who knew the texture of stone, the weight of a lantern, the sound of a gate being barred. They were men who learned to be alone with their thoughts, to find peace in the darkness, to accept the silence as a companion. Let us consider the training of a watchman. It was not formal like that of a soldier. A man learned by serving alongside an older watchman, watching how he moved, how he listened, how he stood. He learned to read the signs of the night. The smell of rain coming on the wind, the way the stars told the time, the difference between the footfall of a man and the footfall of a horse. He learned to judge distance by sound, to know how far away a shout was by its echo against the walls. He learned to discipline his eyes, to look not at a single point, but to let his gaze soften and take in the whole field of view. For in the dark, you do not see things directly. You see them out of the corner of your eye, a movement that is gone before you turn. He also learned patience. Patience was perhaps the most important skill. The watchman could not afford to be restless, to pace, to fidget. He had to stand still for hours, his body relaxed, but his mind alert. He learned to breathe slowly, to let his thoughts drift like clouds, but to always come back to the present moment, to the wall, to the night. The Byzantines had a word for this kind of watchfulness, nepsis, a term used by the monks for the practice of inner vigilance. The watchman was a kind of monk of the walls, practicing a secular form of that ancient discipline. And so, as the night deepens, we can imagine a watchman on the Theodosian walls, somewhere near the gate of Carisius. He is an old man, perhaps, with a grizzled beard and a scar on his cheek from an old wound. He does not move much. He leans on his staff, his eyes half closed, but he is not asleep. He is listening. He can hear the city breathing, the soft exhalation of 1,000 sleeping souls. He can hear the wind sifting through the crenellations, a sound like a distant whisper. He can hear the cry of a baby, far away, quickly muffled. He can hear the footsteps of a patrol on the inner wall, the crunch of gravel under boots. He knows every stone of this section of the wall, every crack, every loose brick. He has walked it for 20 years. He knows where the moss grows thickest, where the pigeons nest, where the rain pools. He knows the names of the other watchmen on this stretch, their habits, their stories. He knows that the young watchman on the next tower, a man from the provinces, is homesick and often hums a song from his village. He knows that the sergeant of the watch is a strict man, but fair, and that he checks the posting of the guards twice a night. And the old watchman knows that tonight is like any other night, and that is a good thing. For if the night is ordinary, it means the city is safe. It means the enemy is not at the gates, the plague is not in the streets, the fire is not burning in a forgotten corner. The ordinary night is a gift, a quiet blessing, and the watchman receives it with gratitude, even if he never says so aloud. But let us not romanticize too much. The life of a watchman was hard. The pay was low, the hours long, the conditions often miserable. The food was simple: bread, dried figs, a bit of cheese, and water or weak wine. The watchman carried a small leather pouch with his rations, and he would eat while standing, one eye on the darkness. He had no bed, no shelter from the weather, except the small tower rooms that were often cold and damp. He suffered from rheumatism, from coughs, from the ache of standing on stone for hours. He was subject to the whims of his superiors, to the politics of the court, to the occasional purge when a new emperor came to power and replaced the old guard. And yet, men continued to serve. They served for the sake of the city, for the sake of their families, for the sake of a small but steady income. They served because it was a duty, and duty was a virtue that the Byzantines held dear. They served because, in the darkness, there was a kind of dignity in standing watch, a quiet pride in being the one who did not turn away. There is a story from the Chronicles, from the time of Emperor Heraclius in the 7th century, when the Persians besieged the city. The walls were under constant assault, and the watchmen were stretched thin. One night, a watchman named John saw a strange light in the sky. It was a luminous cross hanging above the dome of Hagia Sophia. He called to the other watchmen, and they all saw it. The light remained for hours and then faded. The next morning, the story spread through the city, and the people believed it was a sign from God that the city would be saved. And indeed, the siege was lifted soon after. John the Watchman became famous, and his name was recorded in the annals. But John himself, it is said, did not think he had done anything special. He had simply looked up, as he always did, and seen what was there. That is the nature of the watchman's calling. He sees what others do not, because he is always looking. He hears what others do not, because he is always listening. He is the city's eyes and ears, but he is also its memory, its quiet recorder of the night. And in that role, he is connected to all the watchmen who came before him, stretching back to the founding of the city, back to the time when Byzantium was a small Greek town on the Bosporus, and a watchman stood on a wooden palisade, looking out at the Thracian hills. As the night moves toward the third hour, the hour of the morning, the city begins to stir. The first bakers light their ovens, and the smell of bread drifts through the streets. The night watchman on the land wall can smell it, even from his high perch, and his stomach rumbles. He knows that soon his relief will come, and he can go down into the city, buy a warm loaf, and eat it on his way home, the steam rising in the cold air. He thinks of his wife, of the small apartment near the cistern of a spar, of the bed that will feel so good after a long night. He shifts his weight from one foot to the other. The stars are beginning to fade. The constellation of the Boötes is setting in the west. The watchman knows this because he has learned to read the sky. He knows that when the star Arcturus sinks below the wall, it is almost dawn. He watches it go, a slow farewell. And then he takes a deep breath, and he feels something like peace, because he has done his duty. He has guarded the city. He has kept the darkness at bay. And now the light is coming as it always does. The roosters will crow, the bells will ring, and the great city of Constantinople will wake to another day. And the night watchman will go to sleep, knowing that he will be back on the wall tomorrow night, and the night after, as long as the city stands. But let us, for a moment, linger. Let us not rush to the dawn. Let us stay with the watchman in the last hour of darkness, when the world is deepest in sleep, and the silence is like a blanket. This is the time when the watchman feels most alone, but also most connected. He is alone on the wall, but he is part of a chain that stretches around the city, a necklace of light and vigilance. He knows that 100 other watchmen are also standing, also listening, also watching the same stars. It is a communion of the night, a brotherhood of the waking. He might think of the emperor, asleep in the great palace, guarded by the Varangian guard, but ultimately dependent on the watchmen on the walls. He might think of the patriarch, praying in his church, his prayers rising like incense. He might think of the poor families in the tenements, the merchants in their shops, the monks in their monasteries, all of them trusting him. And that trust that unspoken weight, gives his duty a solemnity that makes the cold and the fatigue bearable. And then a sound that is not part of the night, a soft scraping coming from the outer slope of the ditch. The watchman's eyes snap open. He peers into the darkness below. The moon has set, and the night is at its darkest, just before the dawn. But he has trained his eyes. He does not see anything, but he hears the scrape again, and then a whisper. Someone is out there, trying to climb the ditch, trying to approach the wall. The watchman does not call out. He does not want to alert the intruder. Instead, he slowly, silently reaches for his horn. He puts it to his lips. He cannot blow it yet, not until he is sure. But he is ready. He waits. The scraping continues, and now he sees a shape, a dark form moving along the bottom of the ditch, below the outer wall. It is a man, alone, carrying a bundle on his back. He is trying to find a way through the outer wall, perhaps a damaged section, a hidden gap. The watchman holds his breath. He could call out, but that might give the man a chance to flee. He could sound the alarm, but that would wake the whole guard for a single intruder. He decides to act quietly. He picks up a small stone, one of many that lie on the parapet, and he drops it carefully, so it lands near the intruder, a small clatter. The intruder freezes. He looks up, and the watchman sees his face, pale in the darkness. It is a young man with a desperate look. He whispers, "Please, I am a refugee. I have escaped from the Bulgars. I seek sanctuary." The watchman hesitates. He has heard such stories before. Sometimes they are true, sometimes they are traps. But the young man looks terrified, and he carries a bundle that seems to hold a small child. The watchman makes a decision. He calls down softly, "Stay where you are. I will send for a rope. You will be taken to the gate, and you will be questioned. If your story is true, you will be given shelter. If not, you will be handed over to the guards." The young man nods, his eyes full of hope. The watchman signals to the next tower, where a junior guard is dozing. He wakes him with a whistle and quickly explains the situation. In a few minutes, a rope is lowered, and the young man climbs up, clutching his bundle. Inside is indeed a child, a girl of about 3, sleeping soundly. They are both thin, dirty, exhausted. The watchman leads them down to the inner gate, where the day guard is just arriving. He hands them over with a brief report, and then he returns to his post, just as the first light of dawn touches the horizon. The sky turns a pale gold, and the sea walls catch the color, glowing softly. The young refugee and his child will be processed, fed, and given a place in the city. The watchman will go home, tired but satisfied. Another ordinary night, but with a small act of mercy. That too was part of the watchman's duty. Not just to guard against threats, but to be the first point of contact for those who came seeking refuge, seeking a new life within the walls. And so, as the sun rises over the Sea of Marmara, and the bells of Hagia Sophia ring out the morning hymn, we leave the watchman to his rest. The night is over. The walls are still standing. The city endures, and the watchmen, those silent guardians, have done their work again. Their stories are small, but they are countless, and together they form the great tapestry of Constantinople's 1,000-year vigil. Now, let us close our eyes for a moment. Imagine the cool stone beneath your hands. Listen to the wind, the distant sound of a ship's horn, the soft chirping of birds. Feel the slow rhythm of your own breath. This is the night on the walls of Constantinople, a night that repeats itself over and over, a night that holds the city in its embrace. And as you drift toward sleep, know that somewhere in a long ago time, a watchman stood exactly where you are now, watching, waiting, keeping the darkness at bay. Sleep well. The walls are strong. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember about the night watchmen of Constantinople. They were not soldiers in the usual sense, not warriors with swords and shields, though they carried both. They were something older, something quieter. They were watchers. Their duty was not to fight, but to see, and in seeing, to prevent the need for fighting. They were the city's first line of defense, but also its last line of awareness, the ones who noticed the small cracks in the wall before they became breaches, the ones who heard the whispers of conspiracy before they became uprisings, the ones who smelled the smoke before it became a conflagration. Let us consider, for a moment, the tools of their trade. They were not elaborate. A horn carved from a ram's horn, polished smooth by years of handling. A lamp filled with olive oil, its flame carefully trimmed so it would not smoke or sputter. A staff of sturdy oak, about the height of a man, with an iron tip and a hook for pulling things up from the ditch. A cloak of thick wool, dyed a dark blue that blended with the night. And a small whistle, made of bone or clay, for signaling to the next tower in the chain. These were the watchman's companions, as familiar to him as his own hands. He knew how to clean the lamp, how to trim the wick so it burned steady and bright for hours. He knew how to oil the horn so it would not crack in the cold. He knew how to wrap his cloak tightly around himself when the wind blew from the north, and how to loosen it when the air was still and damp. He knew the exact pitch of his whistle and could recognize the pitch of each of his fellow watchmen, so that in the darkness he could tell who was signaling without needing to see them. The training for a watchman was not formal, but it was thorough. A new watchman would spend his first few weeks shadowing an experienced one, learning the rhythm of the night. He would learn where the weak spots in the wall were, the places where the mortar had crumbled, the stones that had shifted after an earthquake. He would learn which sections of the ditch were deepest and which were shallow enough to cross on foot. He would learn the names of the gates, the towers, the cisterns, and the chapels that dotted the wall. He would learn the sound of the wind coming from the sea versus the wind coming from the hills, and how each brought different smells and sounds. He would also learn the lore of the walls. Every watchman had a story about a ghost on the wall, a specter seen only in the hour before dawn, when the veil between worlds was said to be thinnest. Some said it was the spirit of a soldier from the time of Constantine, still pacing his post, unable to leave. Others said it was a woman in white, who had thrown herself from the wall when her lover was killed in a siege. The watchmen would tell these stories in hushed voices, not because they believed them entirely, but because the stories were part of the night, part of the texture of their solitary hours. and sometimes the stories were true. There was a watchman named Theophanes, a man of no particular distinction, who had been on the wall for 20 years. One night, he saw a figure standing on the parapet of a tower that had been abandoned for a century, a tower that was crumbling and unsafe, its entrance sealed. The figure was tall and dark, and it did not move. Theophanes watched it for a long time, his heart beating fast, but he did not call out. He knew the rules. He knew that if he was not sure, he should not act. So he watched, and he counted his breaths, and he waited. The figure did not move, stood there perfectly still for the entire night. When dawn came, it was gone. Theophanes went to that tower the next day, and he found nothing. No footprints, no signs of entry. The seal on the door was intact, and yet he had seen it. He told the story to the other watchmen, and they nodded, and they did not laugh, because they, too, had seen things in the long hours of the night, things that could not be explained, things that were perhaps only the tricks of the mind, but felt real enough in the moment. But let us not dwell too long on the spectral. The watchman's world was mostly the world of the real, the tangible. The cold stone, the worn leather of his boots, the rough wool of his cloak, the scrape of his staff on the parapet as he walked. These were the sensations that filled his night over and over until they became automatic, as familiar as his own heartbeat. There was a watchman named Michael, who had been a fisherman before he took up the post. He had spent his youth on the Sea of Marmara, pulling in nets of mackerel and anchovies, and he had learned to read the sea the way other men read books. He could see the surface of the water and know what was beneath it. He could smell the air and know when a storm was coming. He could feel the vibration of the water in the wood of his boat and know how far he was from shore. When he became a watchman, he brought that knowledge with him to the wall. He would stand on the sea walls, looking out at the dark water, and he would see things that other watchmen missed. A slight discoloration in the water, suggesting a submerged obstacle. A pattern of ripples that indicated a ship moving without lights. Faintest glimmer of a reflected star, where a ship's hull had disturbed the surface. He was like a living sonar, a human echo of the sea. One night, Michael noticed something odd. A patch of water near the base of the wall seemed darker than the rest, as if something was blocking the starlight. He watched it for a long time, and he saw that it was moving very slowly along the wall. It was a small boat, he realized, rowed by a single man, and it was hugging the wall so closely that it was almost invisible. The man was trying to reach the small postern gate, a little door that led from the wall directly to the sea, used only by fishermen and smugglers. Michael did not alert the guard. He did not want to cause a commotion. Instead, he quietly moved along the wall, keeping pace with the boat. When the man reached the gate, Michael was there, standing on the wall above him, looking down. He called out softly, in the voice he used to calm the waves, "Peace, I see you. I know what you are doing. You are a fisherman like I once was. You are trying to enter the city without paying the toll. Is that not so?" The man in the boat looked up, startled, tried to deny it, but Michael's voice was gentle, and after a moment, the man confessed. He had a small catch, a few baskets of fish, and he was trying to sneak them in to avoid the tax at the great gate. Michael could have reported him, could have sounded the alarm, and the man would have been arrested, his boat confiscated. But Michael remembered his own days as a poor fisherman, and he knew how hard life was. Instead, Michael said, "I will let you pass this once, but go to the great gate. Pay the toll. It is a small price for the safety of the city. And the next time you try to smuggle, I will not be so forgiving." The man nodded, his expression grateful, and he rowed away around the point toward the main harbor. Michael watched him go, and then he returned to his post, and the night continued as before. This was not a story of heroism or adventure. It was a story of kindness, of a small mercy extended by a watchman who had once been a fisherman. And that, too, was part of the watchman's duty, to be not just a guardian, but a judge of moments, a person who could decide when to enforce the law and when to bend it, when to sound the alarm, and when to whisper a warning. The residents of Constantinople, for their part, had a complicated relationship with the watchmen. They respected them, but they also feared them. The watchmen were the eyes of the emperor, the ones who reported anything unusual. A late-night gathering, a suspicious shipment, a stranger who lingered too long in one place. The watchmen were not spies, but they were observers, and their reports could lead to arrests and interrogations. And so, the people of the city treated the watchmen with a careful courtesy. They did not approach them lightly. They did not ask questions. They simply went about their business, aware that somewhere above them, on the wall, a pair of eyes was watching. It was a subtle form of control, a gentle discipline that kept the city orderly without the need for overt force. But the watchmen were not all stern and distant. They had their own lives, their own families, their own small joys. The watchman on the land wall, the one we have been following, had a son who was apprenticed to a coppersmith. The boy was learning to make pots and pans, to shape metal with heat and hammer. The watchman was proud of him, but he also worried. The coppersmith's shop was near the forum, and the smoke and noise were constant. He hoped his son would find a better trade, one that did not leave him coughing in the evenings. His daughter, who was 9, had a talent for singing. She would come to the wall sometimes, on the days when he was off duty, and she would sing for him, her voice clear and high, carrying over the fields beyond the wall. The other watchmen would smile and listen, and for a few moments, the grimness of their work would lift. The girls' songs were simple things, folk tunes about the sea and the harvest, but they were beautiful, and they reminded the watchmen of why they guarded the city, not just for the emperor, not just for the walls, but for the children who sang in the afternoon light. There was a watchman named Nikephoros, who was known for his love of cats. He had a small tabby cat that had adopted him years ago, a stray he had found mewing in the ditch. He had named her Thalassa because she was the color of the sea, and she followed him everywhere. Every night, she would climb the stairs to his tower and curl up at his feet, purring softly. The presence of the cat was a comfort, a warm living thing in the cold night. Other watchmen teased him about it, but Nikephoros did not mind. He would stroke Thalassa's head and whisper to her, telling her about the stars and the ships and the stories of the night. And Thalassa, for her part, was a good watch cat. She would prick up her ears at strange sounds, her pupils dilating in the darkness. She would hiss if someone approached too quietly. She was, in her own way, a second pair of eyes, a small furry sentinel who shared the watchman's vigil. And when the dawn came, she would stretch, yawn, and follow him down the stairs, ready for a day of sleeping on a warm windowsill. The animals of Constantinople were aware of the watchman, too. The dogs in the streets knew not to bark at the watchman's footsteps. The horses in the stables knew when a watchman passed by, and they would sometimes stamp their feet in recognition. There was a flock of seagulls that nested on the sea walls, and they had learned that the watchman would not harm them. They would perch on the parapets, their heads tucked under their wings, and they would sleep, trusting that the watchman would not disturb them. And so, the walls of Constantinople were not just a structure of stone and mortar. They were a living ecosystem, a community of men and animals, of ghosts and stories, of small kindnesses and quiet duties. They were the backbone of the city, the framework upon which everything else was built. And the watchmen were the pulse of that backbone, the heartbeat that kept the walls alive through the long hours of darkness. Let us think now of the changing of the guard. It happened at dawn, at noon, at sunset, and at midnight. Each shift was about 6 hours, depending the season. The watchmen would gather at the guardhouse near the Golden Gate, a large chamber with a stone floor and a hearth that was always burning. Here they would exchange news, share stories, and drink warm wine or broth. The off-duty watchmen would lie on straw pallets, wrapped in their cloaks, trying to snatch a few hours of sleep before their next turn. The guardhouse was a noisy place, full of voices and laughter and the clatter of boots on stone. But it was also a place of camaraderie, of bonds forged by shared hardship. The watchmen knew that they could rely on each other, that in the dark night, when a sound came from the ditch, the man in the next tower would be listening, too. They were a brotherhood, united by the night. And when the new shift took their positions on the wall, the old shift would file down, their feet heavy with exhaustion. They would gather their belongings, check their lamps, and head home. Some lived nearby, in the narrow streets of the Blasherny district, their apartments tucked in the shadow of the wall. Others lived farther away in the old city, and they would walk through the morning traffic, the smells of bread and coffee and fried fish rising around them. They were not heroes. They were not legends. They were men doing a job that was monotonous and uncomfortable and occasionally frightening. But it was also a job that mattered. Every night, they stood between the city and the darkness. Every night, they held the line. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing of all. Not the great battles, not the heroic deeds, but the simple, unglamorous act of showing up, night after night, and doing what needed to be done. The watchmen of Constantinople were not famous. Their names are lost to history, but their vigilance kept the city alive for 1,000 years. So let us find a comfortable place to rest, and let our thoughts drift back to that wall, to that watchman, to that small flame in the lamplight. The wind is cool, is warm. The stars are fading, and the dawn is near. The city sleeps, and the watchman watches. And there is something deeply peaceful in that thought, something that soothes the restless mind. We are guarded, even now, by the memory of those who watched before us. The walls of Constantinople may be crumbling, but the spirit of the watchman endures. It lives in every person who stays awake to keep others safe, in every quiet guardian who stands their post through the long night. And with that, we can let go. We can allow our eyes to grow heavy, our thoughts to slow. The story is not over, but it is resting, like the watchman resting after his shift, like the city resting in the safety of its walls. We will return to it, but for now, we can sleep. Sleep well. The walls are strong, and the watchmen are watching. But let us linger a while longer, for there is more to the night. The watchmen of Constantinople did not only guard the land walls that faced the Thracian fields. There were the sea walls as well, the long fortifications that hugged the Marmara shore and the Golden Horn. Here the watchman's work was different, shaped by the rhythm of the waves and the salt-laden wind. The sea walls were lower than the land walls, for the water itself was a defense, but they were no less important. The watchmen who stood there had to watch the water, not just the shore. They had to notice when a fishing boat lingered too close, when a merchant galley changed its course, when the moonlight caught something that should not have been there. On the Sea of Marmara side, the walls ran for miles, broken by towers that had once been painted with stripes of red and white, though the colors had faded with the centuries. The watchmen would carry their lamps along the walkways, their footsteps echoing on the stone, and they would listen to the sound of the water slapping against the base of the wall. It was a gentle sound, hypnotic, like a lullaby. A new watchman had to fight the urge to nod off, lulled by the constant murmur of the sea. But the old watchman knew the danger of that sleepiness. They would pinch themselves, or stamp their feet, or think of their families to keep their minds alert. There was a watchman named Ioannis who served on the sea wall near the palace of Blasharny. He was a quiet man with a beard that had gone gray early. He had been a sailor in his youth, and the sea still called to him. On calm nights, when the moon hung low over the Marmara, he would stand at the parapet and remember the voyages he had taken, the ports he had seen, would think of Alexandria with its great lighthouse and its crowds of merchants. He would think of Trebizond, where the mountains met the sea, and he would think of the storms, the terrible storms that had nearly taken his ship. He had left the sea because his wife had begged him to, afraid that one day he would not return. So he had become a watchman, a life that kept him on land, but still close to the water. The other watchmen on the sea wall were a mixed lot. Some were retired sailors like Ioannis. Others were young men who had grown up in the fishing villages along the Bosphorus. They knew the currents and the winds, the signs of a coming squall. They could read the sea the way a farmer reads the sky, and they used that knowledge in their work. When the wind shifted suddenly, they would send a runner to the harbor master. When the waves grew strange, they would light extra torches, warning ships away from the walls. The sea wall watchmen also had to contend with the seals. there were colonies of seals that lived on the rocks near the walls, and they would bark loudly at night, their calls echoing across the water. At first, the seals had startled the watchmen, the sound seeming like a cry for help. But they had learned to distinguish the seals' voices. A seal barking was just a seal. A man shouting in the water was something else. They had developed a kind of code, a way of knowing when to pay attention and when to let the sound drift away. And then there were the gulls. The sea walls were covered with seabirds, hundreds of them, roosting on the parapets and the broken edges of the stones. The watchmen had to be careful not to disturb them, for if the gulls took flight in a panic, they might alert an enemy. So the watchmen walked softly, their steps measured, their lamps dimmed. They had learned to move like the birds themselves, silent and watchful. In the winter, the sea walls were brutal. The wind off the water cut through the thickest cloak, and the spray from the waves would freeze on the stone, making the walkways treacherous. The watchmen would wrap their faces in wool, leaving only slits for their eyes, and they would huddle in the towers, feeding the small braziers that burned charcoal. The smoke would rise, mixing with the mist, and from a distance, the towers looked like chimneys of some great house. But even in the cold, there was beauty. On nights when the sea was calm and the stars reflected in the black water, the view from the sea walls was breathtaking. The city behind them would be a nest of golden lights, the domes and minarets silhouetted against the sky. The watchmen would sometimes pause, just for a moment, to take it in. They were part of that city, a living stone in its walls, and they knew that the beauty they saw was worth protecting. Now, let us turn to the Golden Horn, the great estuary that formed the northern harbor of Constantinople. Here the sea walls were different again, for the water here was busy with ships, with the masts of merchant vessels, with the small boats that ferried goods across the inlet. The watchmen on the Golden Horn walls had to watch not only for enemies, but for fires. A ship catching flame in the night could spread quickly, leaping from vessel to vessel, turning the harbor into an inferno. The watchmen kept a close eye on the ship lanterns, making sure they were properly extinguished after loading. They had buckets of sand and water placed at intervals along the wall, and they knew the locations of the fire pumps, just in case. One of the watchmen on the Golden Horn wall was a man named Andreas, who had a limp from an old injury. He had been a carpenter before, building boats in the dockyards. He knew every ship in the harbor by name, or at least by its shape and rigging. He would mutter to himself as he walked, naming the vessels: the Theodicus, the Archangel, the Sea Star. Each ship was a story, a journey, a cargo of dreams. Andreas loved the harbor, the smell of tar and salt and spices, the distant cry of sailors in a foreign tongue. He would sometimes bring a small piece of wood with him, a piece of pine or oak, and he would whittle it in the tower, his hands working even as his eyes scanned the water. Andreas had a habit of talking to the ships. He would tell them good night, as if they were living things. He would say, "Sleep well, little vessel, and tomorrow you will sail again." The other watchmen teased him, but they also listened. There was something comforting in his voice, something that made the night feel less empty. Now we should consider the great chain that stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, a massive barrier of iron links that could be raised to block enemy ships. The watchman at the entrance to the harbor had the duty of monitoring the chain, ensuring it was properly lifted and lowered. It was an immense responsibility, for if the chain was broken or left down, the city could be taken from the water. The watchmen at the chain were among the most trusted, and they were paid a little extra for their trouble. The chain itself was a marvel. Each link was as thick as a man's thigh, forged from the best iron in the empire. It was stored in a great tower near the sea, and it was raised and lowered by a system of winches and pulleys. On a night when the winds were high, the chain would groan and creak, its sound carrying across the water like the lament of a giant. The watchmen would go out to check it, their lanterns swinging, their faces lit by the flickering light. They would touch the iron, feeling its coldness, its strength. They knew that the chain was the city's last defense against a naval attack. But the watchmen were not only concerned with water and chain. They also had to patrol the inner walls, the walls that divided the city itself. Constantinople had several lines of fortification, and the innermost walls, the walls of the emperor's palace, were guarded by the elite Varangian guard. But there were also walls surrounding the great cisterns, the churches, the arsenals. The watchmen of those inner walls had a quieter job, but it was still important. They kept the peace within the city's neighborhoods, ensuring that thieves and vandals did not take advantage of the darkness. One such inner wall was the wall of the Forum of Constantine, a large oval plaza with a central column topped by a statue of the emperor. The Forum was a busy place during the day, filled with merchants and orators and beggars. At night, it was empty, but the watchman who stood at the entrance to the Forum had to make sure no one camped in the colonnades or started fires in the corners. He would walk slowly around the circle of the Forum, his staff tapping on the marble pavement. He would listen for footsteps, for whispers, for the sound of a bottle breaking. This watchman, whose name was Cosmas, had a peculiar habit. He would recite poetry to himself as he walked. He had memorized long passages of Homer, of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he would murmur them under his breath. The words of ancient heroes, of gods and monsters, echoed in the empty Forum. He imagined himself as a sentinel in a story, guarding a city that had seen 1,000 years of history. He would think of the poets who had walked these same streets, of the scholars who had argued in the Stoas. He was not a learned man, not a philosopher, but he felt the weight of the city's past on his shoulders. And sometimes, when the night was very still, he would hear something, a voice perhaps, or a footstep that did not belong. He would stop, his heart beating faster, and he would look around. But there was never anyone there. Was it a ghost, a memory, an echo of a conversation long past? Cosmas did not know, but he did not feel afraid. He felt, instead, a strange comfort, as if the city itself was watching over him. Now, we must speak of the seasons in Constantinople, for the watchman's life changed with the turning of the year. In the spring, The fields beyond the land walls would bloom with wildflowers, and the air would be sweet with the scent of thyme and lavender. The watchmen would breathe deeply, grateful for the warmth after the long winter. They would see the farmers returning to their fields, the oxen plowing the soil, the children laughing as they chased each other through the tall grass. It was a time of hope, of renewal, and the watchmen felt it too. In the summer, the sun beat down on the walls, baking the stone until it was hot to the touch. The watchmen would seek shade in the towers, drinking water from earthenware jugs. They would fan themselves with their hats and dream of cool breezes. The summer nights were short, and the dawn came too quickly. But the summer also brought festivals, celebrations that lit the city with torches and candles. The watchmen would see the crowds in the streets, hear the music and the laughter, and they would feel a part of that joy. In the autumn, the harvest began, and the fields would turn gold and brown. The watchmen would see the wagons piled high with grain and grapes, heading for the city gates. The air would grow cool, and the evenings would come earlier. The watchmen would stock up on wood for their braziers, and they would mend their cloaks against the coming cold. Autumn was a time of preparation, a time to get ready for the long night of winter. And winter, as we have said, was harsh. The snow would pile on the parapets, and the watchmen would have to shovel it away, lest it make the walkways impassable. The winds would howl, and the torches would sputter. The watchmen would shiver, their teeth chattering, but they would not abandon their posts. They knew that winter was the season when enemies might strike, when the cold would numb the fingers of the guards, and the darkness would hide the approach of an army. They stayed because they had to. Through all the seasons, the watchmen kept their watch. They saw the constellations shift across the sky, the Great Bear and the Dragon and the Little Bear. They learned the movements of the planets, the phases of the moon. They became astronomers of a sort, knowing that the stars were their companions in the long night. And they told stories. In the towers, when the wind was high and the night was long, the watchmen would share tales. Stories of the Emperor Justinian, who had built Hagia Sophia. Stories of the siege of the Persians and the Avars, when the walls had held. Stories of the Crusaders, who had been welcomed, and then had turned against the city. The watchmen knew the history of their walls, the great and terrible events that had taken place there, and they knew that they were part of that history, a small link in a chain that stretched back to Constantine himself. Sometimes, a watchman would tell a story of his own, something that had happened on his shift. A strange light, a mysterious sound, a figure seen in the mist. These stories were told in low voices with a sense of wonder. They were not meant to be believed, but they were meant to be heard. They were the folklore of the night, the myths that the watchmen created for themselves. And the night would pass slowly, carefully, like water through a sieve. The watchmen would count the hours until the dawn, until the bells of the churches began to ring, marking the start of a new day. They would see the first light appear over the hills of Asia, the sky turning pink and gold. They would hear the cocks crowing in the courtyards, the dogs barking, the distant sound of a cart moving through the streets. And then, at the changing of the guard, they would descend from the walls. They would hand over their lamps, their staffs, their responsibilities. They would walk home, their legs aching, their eyes tired. They would fall into their beds, and they would sleep, and in their dreams, they would still see the wall, the stars, the endless line of stone that stretched into the dark. So let us think of them now, those watchmen of long ago. They are gone, but the night they guarded remains. And if you listen closely, on a quiet night, you might hear the echo of their footsteps, the soft whisper of their voices. You might feel the weight of their vigil, passing down through the centuries, until it reaches you in your own safe room, in your own quiet home. Sleep well. The walls are still standing, in memory if not in stone, and the watchmen are still watching. But the story does not end there. For the watchmen of Constantinople, the night was a living thing, and it held many secrets. The walls themselves were not merely stone and mortar. They were a membrane between the city and the world beyond. And the watchmen were the ones who pressed their ears against that membrane, listening to the heartbeat of the darkness. Let us speak now of the sea walls, those defenses that faced the Marmara Sea. They were lower than the land walls, but they were no less important. For if an enemy fleet managed to slip past the great chain, the sea walls would be the last barrier before the city's heart. The watchmen there had a different duty. They watched the water, not the land. They looked for the glint of oars under the moonlight, the dark shape of a ship moving without lights. They listened for the splash of a muffled oar, the whispered command of a captain. The sea walls were often wet with spray, and the stones were slick with salt. The watchmen wore heavy woolen cloaks that smelled of brine. They would lean against the parapets and gaze out at the waves, which seemed to stretch into infinity. On a clear night, they could see the lights of the Asian shore, the faint glimmer of lamps in houses across the strait. On a stormy night, the sea would roar, and the spray would sting their faces. They would pull their hoods tighter and wait. One such watchman, whose name was Nikon, had a peculiar habit. He would count the ships, not the ships that passed during the day, but the phantom ships that appeared only in the dreams of the night. He would see the outlines of ancient triremes, the ghostly sails of Roman merchantmen, the shadows of Viking longships that had sailed down the rivers from the north. He knew these were fantasies, but he could not help himself. The sea held memories, and he felt them pressing against his mind. And sometimes, on the calmest of nights, he would hear a sound that was not the wind. It was a low, mournful singing, as if from the depths. The sailors of the city whispered of a mermaid who lived beneath the waves, a creature who had once been a woman of the palace, transformed by a sorcerer's curse. She sang for the watchmen, they said, to lure them into the water. But Nikon did not believe the tale. He thought the sound was the sea itself, sighing as it remembered the ships that had sunk, the men who had drowned. He would answer the sound with his own voice, humming a hymn he had learned as a child. The two sounds would mingle, the human and the ocean, and for a moment, the night would feel holy. Now let us turn our attention to the Blasharny Palace, the imperial residence that sat at the northern end of the land walls. This was a place of immense power and intrigue. The watchmen who guarded the palace walls were a select group trusted by the emperor himself. They wore fine uniforms, their cloaks embroidered with gold thread. They carried not staffs but swords, and their helmets were polished until they shone. But even these elite watchmen knew the weight of the night. They stood at the gates, staring into the darkness of the city, knowing that enemies could be within as easily as without. The palace was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, and there were whispers that secret passages led from the emperor's bedchamber to hidden exits in the walls. The watchmen learned the maps by heart, but they never spoke of what they knew. One night, a watchman named Leontius saw something that troubled him. He was on the roof of the palace, overlooking the great courtyard. The moon was full, and he could see every detail: the fountain, the statues of emperors, the carved eagles. And then he saw a figure, a man in a dark cloak, moving quickly along the colonnade. The figure did not walk like a servant or a guard. He seemed to glide, his feet barely touching the ground. Leontius raised his lantern, but the light did not reach. The figure disappeared into the shadow of a pillar. Leontius descended from the roof and searched the colonnade. There was no one, but on the marble floor he found a single petal, a white rose petal, fresh as if plucked only moments ago. He picked it up and held it in his palm. He thought of the empress, who was known to have a garden of roses on the roof of her private chapel. He thought of the rumors of lovers and spies that filled the palace. But he said nothing. He tucked the petal into his cloak and returned to his post. The night held its secrets. As dawn approached, the sky over the Blasharny Palace turned a pale lavender. The watchmen heard the cocks crowing from the nearby farms, the sound carried on the wind. They saw the first rays of sunlight touch the golden mosaics of the palace chapel, igniting them with fire. The night was ending, and the city was safe for another day. But we must not forget the animals of Constantinople. The feral cats that roamed the walls were the watchmen's companions. They were sleek and clever, their eyes gleaming in the dark. They would follow the watchmen on their rounds, rubbing against their legs, purring in the silence. The watchman would sometimes share a scrap of bread or a piece of dried fish. The cats knew every corner of the fortifications, every crack where a rat might hide. They were the silent partners of the night watch. And the dogs, too, were there. They belonged to the city, wandering in packs, guarding the markets and the intersections. They would bark at shadows, and the watchman would know that something had stirred. But the dogs were not always friendly. Sometimes a pack would growl at a watchman, and he would have to stand his ground, his staff ready. It was a delicate dance, man and beast sharing the night. One watchman, a kind man named Paul, had a special bond with a stray dog he called Argus. The dog was old and scarred, with one ear torn. Paul would feed him every night, and Argus would follow him along the wall, his tail wagging slowly. They would walk together under the stars, two creatures of the night. One winter evening, when the snow was falling thick and fast, Argus did not appear. Paul called for him, But there was no answer. He searched the towers, the gates, the inner courtyards. He found Argus lying in a sheltered alcove near the gate of St. Romanus. The old dog was breathing shallowly, his eyes half closed. Paul knelt beside him and stroked his fur. He spoke to him softly in the language of his childhood. He promised to stay with him. The snow fell, covering their footprints. Paul built a small fire in the alcove, using wood from a nearby store. He wrapped his cloak around the dog, and together they waited. The night was long and cold, but Paul did not leave. When dawn came, Argus was still alive. Paul carried him to a veterinary healer he knew in the city, and the dog recovered. From that night on, Argus never left his side. The Watchmen often joked that Paul had found his true love, and he would smile and scratch the dog's ears. These moments of tenderness were part of the Watchman's life, woven into the fabric of duty. The walls were not only a place of vigilance, but also a place of care. The watchmen looked after each other too. When one was ill, another would take his shift. When a watchman's wife gave birth, the others would bring bread and wine and congratulations. They were a brotherhood, a community of the night, and they remembered their dead. In a small chapel near the gate of Carisius, there was a book of names. Each time a watchman died, whether from illness, accident, or old age, his name was written in the book. The watchmen would gather at the chapel and light a candle for him. They would pray for his soul, and they would remember his stories. The book was kept in a locked chest, and only the oldest watchman held the key. It was a treasure of their guild. Now, as we draw near to the end of our tale, let us consider the legacy of these watchmen. The walls of Constantinople stood for over 1,000 years, and the watchmen were there for every one of them. They saw the city grow from a Greek colony to the capital of an empire. They saw it fall to the Crusaders in 1204, only to be recaptured in 1261. They saw the slow decline, the shrinking population, the crumbling of the aqueducts. And they saw the final siege in 1453, when the Ottoman army, led by Mehmed the Conqueror, breached the walls at last. That night, the last watchmen stood at their posts, knowing that the end was near. They did not flee. They fought with swords and spears, with stones and boiling oil. They died on the walls they had guarded all their lives. And when the city fell, the watchmen were among the last to fall, their bodies lying beside the places where they had stood for so many years. But their vigil did not truly end. The stones of the walls still remember their footsteps. The wind still carries their whispers. And if you visit Istanbul today, the city that rose from the ashes of Constantinople, you can walk along the remnants of the Theodosian walls. You can touch the stones that were laid by Roman masons, that were repaired by Byzantine engineers, that were kissed by the hands of countless watchmen. And if you go at night, when the tourist buses have gone and the silence settles, you might feel a presence, a slight pressure on your shoulder, as if someone is watching over you. A faint sound, like the tapping of a staff on ancient pavement. A whisper in a language you do not understand, but that speaks of duty and honor and love for a city that is no more. So let us remember them, those watchmen. They were not great lords or famous generals. They were simple men doing a simple job. But they stood between the city and the dark, and they never wavered. They are the guardians of our sleep, the silent sentinels of history. And now, as the night grows deep and the stars wheel overhead, let us close our eyes. Let us imagine that we are inside the walls of Constantinople, safe in a warm room, while outside the watchman passes by. We hear him cough. We hear him whistle a tune. We hear his footsteps fading into the distance. And we know that we are safe. Good night, and may the watchman watch over your dreams. But perhaps you are not yet ready to sleep. Perhaps the night is still young, and the story of the watchman lingers in your mind like the scent of a candle that has just been extinguished. Let us then drift a little further into the quieter corners of their world, where time itself seemed to move at a slower pace. There was, for instance, the matter of the watchman's meals. They did not eat grand feasts while on duty. A simple loaf of bread, perhaps a piece of cheese, a handful of olives, and a flask of watered wine. They would sit on the stone benches inside the towers, their backs against the cool wall, and eat in silence, listening to the wind. Sometimes they would share stories, but those stories were rarely of battles or emperors. They were stories of home. The wife who had baked the bread, the child who had taken his first steps, the neighbor whose goat had escaped into the street. These small tales, told in low voices, were the fabric of their lives, and they had their rituals. At the beginning of each shift, the watchmen would gather at the chapel of the Holy Archangels, a small domed building near the gate of St. Romanus. They would light a lamp before the icon of St. Michael, the patron of guardians, and they would pray for strength and watchfulness. The priest, an old man with a beard white as snow, would bless them with holy water, and they would touch their foreheads and their chests. Then they would go to their posts, the taste of the water still on their lips. One of the watchmen, a young man named Demetrios, had a special devotion to Saint Minas, a soldier saint who was said to protect travelers and guards. Demetrios carried a small silver medal of the saint around his neck, and he would kiss it every time he passed a crossroads. He believed that the saint had saved his life during a patrol when a loose stone fell from a parapet and missed his head by a hand's breadth. He whispered a prayer of thanks every time he recalled that moment. The seasons changed the nature of the watch. In spring, the walls were covered with wildflowers that had taken root in the cracks. The watchmen would pick a few and press them into their cloaks to give to their wives or children. In summer, the heat of the day lingered into the night, and they would take off their heavy leather jerkins and walk in their linen tunics, feeling the breeze from the Marmara Sea. In autumn, the winds brought the smell of wood smoke from the city's hearths, and the watchmen would wrap themselves in thicker wool, their breath misting in the air. And in winter, the snow would pile against the outer walls, and they would huddle around braziers, their faces lit by the glow of charcoal. The winter was the hardest. Ice would form on the ramparts, making the stones treacherous. The watchmen would walk slowly, their staffs testing the ground before each step. Sometimes a man would slip and fall, and his comrades would help him up, laughing and cursing at the same time. They learned to wrap cloth around their boots to gain a better grip. They learned to recognize the sound of ice cracking underfoot. There was a watchman named Theophilos who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite during a particularly brutal winter. He had been on duty during a blizzard, unable to see more than an arm's length ahead. The cold entered his gloves and did not leave. When he returned to the guardhouse, his fingers were white and hard. The healer had to cut them off, and Theophilos never played the lyre again, a pastime he had loved. But he stayed on the walls. He said that the loss of his fingers only made him more determined. He would use his staff with a new skill, and he would whistle instead of playing music. The other watchmen would whistle along with him, and they would make a strange, sad music that drifted over the city. And the city listened. The people of Constantinople knew the sounds of the watchmen. They knew the rhythm of their footsteps on the wooden walkways, the clank of their keys, the low murmur of their voices when they spoke to each other across the towers. These sounds were as familiar as the church bells, as the calls of the muezzin from the mosques in later years, as the shouts of the fishmongers in the market. The watchmen were part of the city's heartbeat. Even the emperor himself would sometimes pause at his window to listen. Basil I, who had risen from a peasant to the throne, was said to have a fondness for the night watch. He would walk the walls in disguise, dressed as an ordinary soldier, to see if the watchmen were alert. One night, a watchman named Constantine caught him by the arm and said, "Halt, friend. Where do you go at this hour?" The emperor laughed and revealed himself, and Constantine fell to his knees, trembling. But the emperor raised him up and said, "You have done well. The walls are safe with men like you." And he gave him a gold coin, which Constantine kept for the rest of his life. There were also the women who played a part in the watch. Not as guards, for that was forbidden, but as wives and mothers and daughters who brought food and news to the walls. They would arrive at dusk, carrying baskets of bread and jars of wine. They would sit with the watchmen for a while, talking in hushed voices, then return to the city before the gates closed. Their presence was a comfort, a reminder of what the watchmen were protecting. One such woman, a baker's wife named Anna, would always bring extra loaves for the stray dogs. She knew them by name: Argus, Hector, Pallas. She would break the bread into pieces and scatter it along the wall, and the dogs would follow her as if she were their queen. She had a kind face, and the watchmen loved her. When she died, they carried her bier to the chapel and lit candles for her soul. And there were the children, too. The children of the watchmen would sometimes come to the walls on holidays. They would run along the ramparts, pretending to be soldiers, their laughter echoing in the stone. The watchmen would let them hold their staffs for a moment, and the children would stand tall and proud, as if they were guarding the empire themselves. Then they would return to their mothers, their faces flushed with excitement. All of this is woven into the memory of those stones. You see, the walls of Constantinople were not just a military structure. They were a living thing, a part of the city's body. They absorbed the hopes and fears of generations. They held the warmth of 1,000 braziers, the echo of 1,000,000 footsteps, and the watchmen were the keepers of that warmth. Now, as the night deepens and you lie in your bed, imagine that you can still hear them. The soft shuffle of leather on stone, the jingle of keys, the distant cough of a man who has been standing too long in the cold. These sounds are not gone. They have merely become part of the city's dream. And the city itself, Constantinople, that great and glorious name, has become a memory too. But memories do not die. They live in the stories we tell, in the images we paint in our minds. So close your eyes and let the watchmen walk through your dreams. They are still there on the walls, watching over the sleeping city, watching over you. Good night, truly now. The moon is high, the stars are steady. The watchman's lantern flickers, but it does not go out. Rest and let the centuries wash over you. You are safe. You are home. The walls endure. And truly, the walls endure even now, though they stand no longer in the same form. What remains is broken, worn by 1,000 years of weather and war. Yet the memory of those watchmen clings to the stones like lichen. If you were to walk the ancient ramparts today, in the quiet of a modern night, you might still feel the faint trace of their presence. A sudden stillness in the air, a whisper that sounds like a cloak brushing against stone, the soft glow of a memory lantern, seen only from the corner of your eye. There is a story told by the old women of Istanbul, the city that now covers the bones of Constantinople. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind comes from the north, you can hear the watchmen calling to one another across the towers. Not with words exactly, but with a low, humming chant, like a prayer sung in a dream. The children who live near the Theodosian walls sometimes speak of seeing a man in a dark cloak standing on a broken parapet, looking out toward the sea. He does not move. He does not speak. He simply watches. And then, as the first light of dawn touches the horizon, he fades like morning mist. The historians will tell you that this is nonsense, a tale invented by tour guides to amuse visitors. But the old women know better. They remember the watchmen from the stories their grandmothers told them. And they know that a man who has spent his life guarding a place never quite leaves it. His spirit becomes part of the wind, part of the stone. He is still on duty, even after the empire has fallen and the walls have crumbled. There was an old watchman named Michael, a man of great age and greater humility, who served on the walls for 40 years. He had seen emperors come and go, had watched the ships of enemies and allies alike sail through the Golden Horn. He had lost count of the winters, the storms, the silent nights. On his last day of service, he stood at the tower of Isaac Angelos and looked out over the city one final time. He was too old to climb the stairs easily, so his son, a young watchman named Stephanos, helped him up. They stood together in silence, the father leaning on the son, their breaths making small clouds in the cold air. Michael said, "I have often wondered what it is we are guarding. The walls, the city, the empire. No, I think we guard the people. The baker, the mother, the child. The stray dog that sleeps in the shadow of the gate. is what matters." He paused, then added, "And we guard the memory of those who guarded before us. The man who lost his fingers, the woman who fed the dogs, the priest who blessed us with water. They are still here, you know. They are with us on the stones." Stephanos did not reply. He simply nodded because he understood. And when Michael died a few months later, Stephanos took his father's place on the watch, and he carried that understanding with him. He would sometimes whisper to the wind, "I am here, Father. I am watching." So you see, the watch never truly ends. It passes from one pair of hands to the next, like a lantern passed through a dark corridor. And if you listen closely enough, on a night like this, when the world is still and the only sound is the beating of your own heart, you might hear their footsteps in the distance. A soft, measured rhythm, as steady as the turning of the stars. The walls of Constantinople are now mostly gone, broken by time and by conquest. But the watchmen remain, in the stories and in the stones, in the dreams of those who remember. And if you close your eyes and let yourself drift, you will find that you are not alone. You are being watched over. You are being guarded. And that is a good thing, because in the end, we all need a watchman. Someone to stand in the dark while we sleep. Someone to hold the lantern steady. Good night, truly now. The moon has climbed higher and the stars have grown brighter. The last watchman has lit his brazier and the smoke curls up into the velvet sky. Rest easy. The walls endure and so does the watch. Sleep and let the centuries cradle you. You are safe. You are home.